to Cape Fear Valley's Making Rounds Live, broadcasting and streaming live from the WIDU Community Room.
The WIDU Radio Network, WAGR in Lumberton, WYDU in Red Springs, WEWO in Laurinburg.
Making Rounds Live on 99.7 FM, 1600 AM.
We air every second and fourth Tuesday of the month.
Making Rounds Live.
The purpose of this show is to bring you information on health and wellness.
Here's the host of Making Rounds Live, Omega Jones.
And thank you so much, Ray. Welcome to another edition of Cape Fear Valley Health's Making Rounds Live. I'm your host, Omega Jones. April is Irritable Bowel Syndrome, or IBS Awareness Month. And did you know that this condition affects about 15% of the U.S. population? And since we're on the subject, we will discuss other digestive issues and conditions like GERD. We're going to talk about celiac disease, and we're going to talk about Crohn's disease. Now, these conditions, they can impact our everyday lives. I know this on a first-hand basis. How we eat, what we eat, how we sleep, the way we feel at work, the way we handle with stress. All of this affects these particular conditions. And many people deal with these conditions for years before realizing that something more is going on. Now, let me go on and give you this disclaimer. Since we are talking about these particular issues today, please remember that this broadcast is not a time for you to self-diagnose. This is for informational purposes only. If you, a friend or a family member, feel that you're suffering from anything that we may discuss today, what I want you to do is find yourself a healthcare professional. And speaking of healthcare professionals, ladies and gentlemen, back on the broadcast today, we have Dr. George Abacoba. Dr. Abacoba, he is a medical resident at Cape Fear Valley Health. He is here to help us understand the signs, the symptoms, the treatment options, because the only one I knew about was Nexium. And he's going to tell us how we can take care of all of that. So, Dr. Abacoba, welcome back to Making Rounds Live.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me back.
First, who is Dr. Abacoba, and what is your role at Cape Fear Valley Health?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, I am a second-year resident in internal medicine at Cape Fear Valley. Definitely proud, first member of my family to be a doctor, and just happy to serve my community here locally. My family is originally from Nigeria, but we're from Maryland. That's where I kind of grew up most of my time. And got to live around the world, and glad to kind of come back full circle and, participate in helping out my community here. So.
All right. Now, one of the topics we're going to talk about is irritable bowel syndrome, and this is IBS Awareness Month. For our listeners and viewers who may not know, what exactly is IBS?
Yeah, sure. So IBS is also known as irritable bowel syndrome, right? And it's pretty self-explanatory, right? You have an irritable bowel, your bowel gets upset, right? And it can be sensitive to a number of things. And for everybody, that might be different. IBS is something that can vary in terms of symptoms and triggers for a lot of people. And I think that's important to explain. You might read on the internet and on social media, people saying that, they have, problems with like constipation or diarrhea with certain foods, but it can be very different for a lot of people. IBS is very common. It's very prevalent and often misdiagnosed, not just here, but around the world. And for the most part, it's a diagnosis of exclusion. And what do I mean by that? It's a diagnosis that we need to rule out a lot of other kind of like organic causes of, constipation, diarrhea. And once we rule those out and find that there's no evidence of something more like sinister going on, then we can maybe get to IBS. And by definition, IBS is basically a chronic abdominal pain, but also like bloating and discomfort, constipation or diarrhea. But the pain specifically can happen 1 day per week for up to 3 months, or at least 3 months, and is associated with a few things. The pain should be associated with your bowel movements. So when you pass stool, you should see a change in your pain. And it should be also associated with like a change in like your stool quality, the quality of the stool, and how frequently you're going to the bathroom. So those are some of the criteria that we look at as healthcare professionals.
Dr. Abacoba, how do we know when it's a stomach, excuse me, How do we know when we're having a stomach pain and or a bathroom issue,
Mhm.
or when it's more or less like just something that we ate? How do we know the difference between the two?
Yeah, and that's a good question. It's hard to know initially. I'll say that. I would say the easiest thing to do when it comes to having issues with your bowels, whether it be constipation, diarrhea, or just discomfort, find out what your triggers are. Find out what is causing you to have the pain and the discomfort first. It's not necessarily about self-diagnosis, but what we say in medicine is common, right?
Mhm.
So after you've kind of tried to move away from the triggers, you tried some of like the non-medicine related things, like, making sure your eating habits are better, you're sitting up and or standing after you eat, you're not eating too late before bed. If you're having persistent symptoms, that's when I think you should probably reach out to your doctor for some help.
In case you're just joining us, ladies and gentlemen, April is Irritable Bowel Syndrome Month, or IBS, and we are bringing awareness and to better help us understand these signs, symptoms, treatment options. We have Dr. George Abacoba with us today. Dr. Abacoba, he is a medical resident for Cape Fear Valley Health, and believe it or not, he came straight from the practice to be with us today. It was like, boom, boom. And he was right here. Now, if you would like to be part of this conversation, there are two ways you can do this. First of all, you can give us a call at the WIDU studio. That number is 910-483-6111. Miss Glenda's at the phones, and she will make sure that we get that question answered for you. If you want to go online or if you want to go on the air, you can. If not, don't worry about it. Just give the question. She'll make sure we get it. Another way that you can do this is if you're following the Facebook live stream, you can leave the comments in the Facebook live in the comments section. Leave the question in the comments section, and Lindsay will make sure that we get that question answered. We're also streaming on YouTube, but Lindsay is only one person, and she can only monitor one platform. So you can watch the YouTube, but you just won't be able to answer the questions. And once again, in the studio, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. George Abacoba. Dr. Abacoba, you keep mentioning the word triggers.
Mhm.
What are some of the, first of all, what are the triggers? You mentioned it earlier, but
Right.
just so our listeners will understand it. And what are some of those common triggers?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And the triggers, uh, vary for person to person, right? And typically, especially a lot more, we're seeing a lot of prevalence of a lot of gut issues, right? Not just IBS, but a lot of other gut conditions.
Mhm.
A lot of that has to do with the diet and the quality of the foods we're eating. A lot of the foods, especially that's available in our community, are highly processed. And a lot of people may not necessarily have the true education about what's truly in their food. And so I think what we're seeing is there's a lot of, whether it's chemicals or lab processed parts and components of the foods that actually irritate the gut. And something that I touched on in, I think, the last episode was this kind of gut brain axis, right?
Mhm.
Uh, we call our gut the second brain. And why is that? We call it the second brain because it has over 100 million neurons, right? And this is as many as a spinal cord. And when you think of a neuron, think of it like a main tree trunk, and it has its branches. So when we add all of that up, it probably gets to the billions, multiple of billions. And it all gives information, takes information from the gut about how it should push through food, how it should process food, and send it to the brain via two nerves called the vagus nerve. So think about all those billions of connections. And if there's inflammation and damage to your gut, it's taking all this information and sending it to the brain via two nerves called the vagus nerves. And the brain is a single unit, right, with many neurons itself. So it's important to really, appreciate and respect your gut health because while we all feel our guts gargling all throughout the day and you think nothing of it, there's actually a lot of stuff and processing that goes on behind the scene. And we'll talk about a little bit more about triggers. I know we talked a little bit about food, but
Mhm.
also anxiety, stress.
Mm.
Um, those with even mental health conditions with anxiety and depression often have gut related issues because anxiety and stress can also impact your gut in a way that also, in a way, can mask whether you do have a true gut issue. Because sometimes it might be put off that you don't, but it could actually be a true gut condition that you just aren't quite aware of.
You mentioned stress. Let's delve into that a little more.
Right.
How how much can stress affect IBS symptoms?
Oh, absolutely, it can, and I think it's something that can be a misconception. Sometimes, IBS can present usually either as like constipation predominant, diarrhea predominant, or it could be a mixed picture of both, right? And sometimes, there's a conception that IBS isn't real. These gut issues, if you just let it, go with time, it'll resolve itself. But sometimes people do actually have true gut issues, not just IBS, but something else potentially. And anxiety and stress can absolutely worsen it. And part of the management of IBS is also with stress management. Now, it's not necessarily about all of it being psychological, but it's just kind of how you internalize that stress, and that can also affect your bowels.
And internalizing stress, I'm glad you mentioned that. Both my primary care physician and
Hmm.
my cardiologist, they both tell me how deadly internalizing stress
Oh,
is.
absolutely.
And it's not just the heart, as like you said, it's the different components of the body. So, yes, we do need to learn how to cope with stress, ladies and gentlemen.
Right.
You mentioned foods,
Hmm.
Dr. A. Um, Lab processed foods, that's something new. We never had to worry about that when I was coming up. Caffeine, we talked
Right.
about that before the
Yeah.
broadcast. Um, what foods tend to make everything worse?
So there's a lot of foods typically, but I would definitely say this as a disclaimer: not all foods between everybody really results in like worsening of their symptoms or causes their symptoms, like in terms of like gut issues, right?
Mhm.
So I'll speak broadly and say that generally a lot of the foods that you see on aisles that have very long shelf lives, whether it may be cereals or when I say processed wheats, I mean like highly processed wheat, because surely breads and cereals that aren't highly processed should not have very long shelf life, right? There's chemicals and things that help to stabilize them to sit on the shelf, but these are things that are not natural to the gut. And so these are things that can cause inflammation of your gut. And of course, we can all appreciate, especially in this time, cost effectiveness when it comes to shopping and food. And it's really tough that organic foods are more expensive. But generally, foods that aren't treated with chemicals or highly processed across any kind of store with foods with long shelf life, wheats, grains, cereals, chips.
Mhm.
These are things that can all inflame your gut. Fast food. Let's not forget about that as well,
Mhm.
which we're all guilty of,
Oh,
including me.
yes.
So
Ladies and gentlemen, in the studio, Dr. George Abacoba. He is a medical resident with Cape Fear Valley Health. And April is IBS Awareness Month. So we're talking about IBS. We're going to talk about GERD, Crohn's disease. We're going to try to get in as much as we can. So, like I said, if you want to be part of the broadcast, you can do that by calling 910-483-6111. Or if you're following the Facebook live stream, just leave the question in the comments section and we'll get that question answered for you. Um, Dr. A, you mentioned earlier about lifestyle changes.
right.
What are some of the lifestyle changes other than the foods that we eat? Maybe grow your own vegetables. That would be a good one.
Mhm.
What lifestyle changes can we make to control or better regulate? Well, that's not a good word to use. IBS.
Yeah,
So,
right. No, it's a
it's-
good word. Yeah, regulate. Sometimes you got to control things. Not everything is always curable necessarily. But I will say, generally, for those who have gut issues, again, not all gut issues are IBS. That's important to clarify. But some of the important lifestyle things, outside of food, right? Weight loss. I can't stress this enough. Weight loss is very important. Weight loss is tied into the foods you eat as well. That all can contribute to reflux. It can contribute to problems with your gut. Sometimes it can slow your gut in terms of how quickly it processes food. It can affect the lining of your gut, especially depending on the types of foods you eat. So weight loss very important. That's going to help contribute to improving your symptoms. The other thing is smoking. If you're a smoker or a big drinker, those can affect things. I mean, we'll come to GERD in a little bit because that can also, be an important topic there.
Mm-hmm.
But even with IBS, again, there's, common triggers for everybody. And staying away from harmful things, smoking, alcohol, the weight loss, those are important things as well to clarify. Pregnancy can also cause some gut issues as well, but for a lot of women, this can, be a temporary thing.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of touched on the more modifiable stuff that you can control.
You mentioned GERD, so let's go ahead and go into
Sure.
GERD. Many people deal with this frequent heartburn or acid reflux. I happen to be one of them. And I learned that this could be a sign of something more serious, which actually concerned me a little bit.
Sure.
So, what is GERD and how is it different from the occasional heartburn?
Yeah, and that's also a good question as well. So GERD is something that I think probably over the next few years maybe will kind of be a bit better understood amongst a lot of people in terms of the management, especially. GERD stands for gastroesophageal reflux disease. Let's break it down and keep it simple. Gastroesophageal. Gastro refers to the stomach. Esophageal refers to your food pipe or your esophagus. And reflux disease, right? Reflux means basically where you're getting that acid from your tummy coming up into your food pipe. And that can cause different symptoms. It can cause what we call regurgitation. You get that, chest pain or the heartburn. It can cause, some tummy upsets. It can cause also some bad breath. It can cause a number of things. And with GERD, and a good point is what makes it different from just someone who's having reflux. So I think we all have reflux. Probably 20 to 30% of Americans probably complain of reflux weekly. I've gotten reflux definitely from a few foods I've eaten over time.
Mm-hmm.
And usually when it starts becoming more persistent, over the course of, let's say, 1 to 3 months, and, you've done and tried non-medicine related ways to manage it,
Mm-hmm.
like we mentioned, weight loss, stopping smoking, cutting your alcohol intake, and it's still persistent, that's when it's probably worthwhile coming into your doctor's office. Now, coming to kind of GERD and how we manage that, we'll touch a little bit on that. But usually we start with conservative measures, but we can also give what we call proton pump inhibitors, PPIs. You mentioned Nexium, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's an example of one. And you can also be on another type called histamine 2 antagonists. One's called Pepsid, famotidine is what we call it
Mm-hmm.
pharmacologically. And these are medicines that can be used to help control GERD. Now, touching a little bit on the management. So, uh, usually we can give these medications. And the reason why I say that hopefully more education will come over the years is these are not medications that should be lifelong. These are medications that should only be for short periods of time while you're working on lifestyle factors and changes. And doctors should be able to take you off of it after hopefully anywhere from a couple of months to longer, depending on how well or how much you need it.
And can you explain why, Dr. Abakova, why we're not supposed? Because I know people who have been on these um, antacids, is basically what I call it. They've been on this for a year, and I'm
Right.
like, I'm not a doctor, and I didn't go to
Mhm.
medical school, but that doesn't sound right.
Sound right. Yeah.
So, why should they not be on the Nexiums and Pepsids for a prolonged period of time?
Sure, and this is an important point. So we'll start with this, and then we'll also clarify a little bit on antacids too.
Hmm.
But I'll put all of them together and kind of say that the issue with these, especially more so with like the Nexiums, the what you call the PPIs, the proton pump inhibitors,
Hmm.
is long term their risks are showing more now. A lot of people can actually experience bone fractures, what we call atypical bone fractures. The reason for this is because think about it this way: these medications help to suppress the acid in your stomach. But acid is a good thing too. Acid helps to break down the foods and break down proteins that allow the body to absorb them. But when we're suppressing that acid, what can happen is your body's ability to break down the food and the protein becomes reduced. And so people have maybe difficulty absorbing things like calcium, magnesium, your vitamins like vitamin B12. And so the issue that can arise is, because you're not maybe ingesting or being able to take in and absorb things like calcium and magnesium over time, especially calcium, this can increase your risk of fractures. So we're actually seeing that more often these days. So it's a medicine that, while the immediate uh, effects may not necessarily be apparent for everybody, the risk is there.
Let's talk about the symptoms. Even though we've already said it, you mentioned the heartburn, but are there any other symptoms that people should be aware of if they're facing or if they're experiencing acid reflux?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this comes to like red flag signs. So we can kind of put the symptoms in different boxes, right? So we can have our typical, what we call like GERD symptoms, right? You can get the heartburn, you can get the indigestion, you can get the tummy pain, you can sometimes get nausea. Those are a couple or a handful of symptoms, but there's a long list of stuff that's different for everybody. But what I would say is more concerning is if, despite the interventions with the medication, lifestyle changes, it's not improving. I would say that's concerning. The other thing is weight loss. What I mean by weight loss is unintentional weight loss. That's what we call it in medicine as a red flag symptom. You see that with like when we talk about like cancers, for example. People may all of a sudden notice that over the next month, 2 months, couple of months, they're steadily losing weight without having to try to lose weight. So that's a big red flag sign. Another red flag sign is anemia. So anemia is basically where you have like low blood cells. That could be due to having iron deficiency. And sometimes for some people, especially with like concerns for like gut cancers, you can have little bits of blood that seep into the stools over time that are not very visible. And that can actually cause people to be anemic. That's actually one of the key signs and symptoms we look in the elderly. Someone who's having anemia that we can't explain, we check their gut. We get a colonoscopy and see if they have any cancers. So I'm not saying cancer is the only thing that is what we look for in these situations, but those are kind of some of the red flag symptoms that we would start looking into, like, hey, do we need to put a scope down your throat, a camera test, or one into your bottom where we can be able to look at the top of your gut and the bottom of your gut, see what's going on. You can also get, infections of your tummy from PPI use. And these infections can actually increase your risk of having cancers as well. So those are some things to consider.
Ladies and gentlemen, our in studio guest, Dr. George Abacoba. We're talking about IBS, GERD, and all of that today. And Dr. Abacoba, he is a medical resident at Cape Fear Valley Health. And he has also been, I'll go ahead and let you know now in case you recognize him. Not only has he been on Cape Fear Valley Health, but he has also been on a host of other broadcasts in the community, trying to get the word out, trying to educate us. And we're blessed to have him back in the studio today. So if you have a question, what you can do is give us a call at WIDU, or you can leave the question if you're following the Facebook live stream. You can leave the question in the comment section, and we'll make sure we get those questions answered for you. Also, one thing that I forgot to mention, make sure you share the broadcast. We are discussing a lot of great information here. You're not going to remember all of it. So share the broadcast, and that way you don't have to be a middleman. And today, Dr. George Abacoba, he is our in-studio guest on Making Rounds Live. Dr. Abacoba, let's talk about celiac disease, because I read that most people are talking about gluten and gluten sensitivity. Gluten is something new to me. I'm from the country. We've never heard about this too much.
Sure.
But reports show that roughly 1% of the population has celiac disease. So, what is celiac disease, and how are the two tied together?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. I think what we've seen so far in this conversation is that there's a lot of overlap in symptoms between these different conditions, right? And we talked about this gut access with your brain. And these different conditions affect the gut differently, and the brain responds differently. So we talked about IBS at the beginning. That is really associated with like what we call hypersensitivity to certain foods and triggers that cause your tummy and your bowels to basically flare up and react, right, to these sensitivities to certain things. And GERD we've talked about, right? So, that comes from like, the irritation that comes from certain foods and certain lifestyle habits. And now we're coming to inflammation, right? Inflammation is a general, like physiological process, but inflammation we talk about especially in like immune conditions. What do I mean by immune conditions? Our body has something called an immune system where it helps protect us from external issues, but it also helps to regulate our body and how we react to cells within our own body. Um, Now, coming to celiac disease, it's actually called an autoimmune condition. What do I mean by that? So, auto basically means essentially like it's working in the background. It's a process that is a reaction to certain things, and it's specifically a reaction to something called gluten. Gluten is a very, very small compound that is found in different foods like your barleys, your wheats. And when you think about just your wheats in general, that can affect all different kinds of food groups that you eat, right? Not only just breads, but cereals, pastas, rices. What ends up happening is your body makes what's called antibodies. And these antibodies, think about them as like bouncers, almost like at a nightclub. They march along and protect your body. Antibodies generally in our own system, they march along and protect our body and handle business. They take infections and they dispose of them and have the body react to them in a way that allows it to clear it. But then in some patients, they have what's called autoantibodies that uh, the antibodies, not in a correct way, they react to certain things like gluten and they target it and it can cause inflammation in your bowels. And you raise an important question about like what's it different from when it comes to like gluten insensitivity, right? So gluten insensitivity is another thing, and then we have celiac. Gluten insensitivity, just like the word means, you're insensitive to glucose. Sorry, not to glucose, to gluten, excuse me. And insensitivity is not an immune condition. So that's the important thing to clarify. What I mean by that is you're not generating these antibodies that are attacking parts of your food and causing your bowels to flare up. Actually, it's just more so a reaction, almost kind of like IBS. There's no like real clear cut reason as to why it happens. It's just a sensitivity to it or an insensitivity to it that causes it. And one of the key ways we can distinguish this is if we were to take a sample, like a biopsy from your gut, and look at it right under a microscope, see what's going on. Is there any like cells that have come into the lining of the bowel that are causing inflammation? What we will see in gluten insensitivity is actually that the gut lining should look normal. But in something like celiac disease and also IBD or Crohn's disease, which we'll come to, you'll see different changes in that biopsy that could be concerning for those conditions.
How would a person know if they have celiac disease or just the intolerance or sensitivity?
Yeah. So the main way is, first of all, like I said, know your triggers, right?
Yeah.
If you're finding out triggers that are causing your symptoms, remove them. See if there's any improvement. But I would say additionally, the what we call the definitive way to diagnose conditions
Mhm.
is get a biopsy. So if you're having persistent issues with like, indigestion, maybe some weight loss as well. Um, Weight loss, like I mentioned, is a red flag symptom. It doesn't always mean cancer, but it can also show up in things like celiac disease. The reason for this is, these antibodies, like I said, they cause inflammation, and it can also affect the absorption of minerals and stuff like that. Just how I mentioned, like if we're going upstream into the stomach, PPIs can suppress the acid and they can affect how you absorb minerals and vitamins. So can diseases like celiac disease and Crohn's disease. The inflammation affects the gut lining. The gut lining helps to control and absorb things. If that's compromised, then you affect the minerals and vitamins you absorb. So weight loss is definitely something that would be more of a key finding that I would say would separate gluten insensitivity from celiac. But the definitive way, like I mentioned before, was through biopsy.
During a
Yeah,
biopsy.
biopsy will help you look at the lining and see what's going on.
Can celiac disease, can it affect adults and children differently?
That's a good question. I'm not sure exactly,
Mhm.
but in terms of general symptoms, I would say they're quite similar. But I'd
Mhm.
imagine probably the presentation might be different
Mhm.
amongst adults and children overall. But it's typically diagnosed usually at younger ages. The symptoms become more apparent in early childhood or late childhood.
Okay. Our in studio guest, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. George Abacoba. We're talking about IBS, we're talking GERD, celiac disease, and we're about to talk about Crohn's disease. And Dr. Abacoba, he is a medical resident at Cape Fear Valley Health. As a matter of fact, he rushed straight from the office and came here to do this interview today. So we are greatly appreciative today. Dr. Abacoba, you mentioned Crohn's disease. So let's go ahead and talk about that.
Sure.
It's all over television.
Hmm.
It's all over the internet. What exactly is Crohn's disease so we know we're getting accurate information?
Sure, absolutely. So Crohn's disease, it's actually a condition that's part of a general condition called IBD. I don't want you guys to confuse IBD and IBS. IBS is irritable bowel syndrome. IBD is inflammatory bowel disease. So inflammatory bowel disease, there's two parts. There's Crohn's disease on one side, and there's ulcerative colitis on the other side. These are two conditions that can affect the gut in different ways, but they can cause similar symptoms, but with some like very small differences on a micro level in terms of like what we see on biopsy. But Crohn's disease probably has maybe more of a wider spectrum of symptoms that it can cause, and I'll explain why. So, IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, you get inflammation in your bowels, and it's a disease, right? So, its cause is multifactorial. So, there's multiple causes to it. There can be a genetic link to it, it can be environmental stressors, it can also be immune related. Like I mentioned before, the antibodies, right? They can work against you sometimes in some people. So what can happen in Crohn's disease is typically over the course of over 6 months to a year, patients can report all sorts of symptoms. You can get blood in your stools, not as commonly in Crohn's as in the other side of
Mhm.
IBD, which is ulcerative colitis, but you can get diarrhea. You can get blood in your stools at times. Crohn's disease actually can affect more parts of the gut than ulcerative colitis. Crohn's disease can affect everywhere from the top of your mouth all the way to your rectum and your anus. So at any point in that space, your gut lining stretches for a very very large distance and large area. It's just packaged very well in the body, but along that wide surface area you can get inflammation of the bowels that causes different symptoms. Even at the top of the mouth, people can get ulcers in their mouth, and that can also be a key sign of Crohn's disease. And then on the bottom end, you can get, like I said, diarrhea. You can get blood in your stools, and a whole host of other symptoms.
Dr. Abacoba, you mentioned the symptoms of Crohn's disease. Are there symptoms that people should not ignore?
Yeah. So, we talked about like, tummy pain, gut pain, but I would say definitely if you're experiencing like persistent diarrhea and at times with blood in your stool, I think that's concerning generally. I think that alone should definitely give you a cue to go see your primary care doctor or your gut doctor. And depending on how the history of your symptoms goes, maybe they would recommend what's called a colonoscopy, a camera test where they go in your back passage and have a look. And usually they can take biopsies. And for most of these, types of conditions, usually, like I said, the definitive way to diagnose it is a biopsy.
Ladies and gentlemen, our in studio guest, Dr. George Abacoba, today on Cape Fear Valley Health's Making Rounds Live. Dr. Abacoba, Crohn's disease, is this something that can go undiagnosed?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of these conditions, like I mentioned, there's a lot of overlap. And with Crohn's disease, you can get flares, where there's periods of time where you don't have any symptoms, and there's other periods where it flares up. Like I mentioned, the diarrhea. Again, weight loss is also very important in some of these more serious conditions. But overall, I would say with Crohn's, it can get misdiagnosed, and at times, people may, think these symptoms are just associated to certain foods that they're eating or triggers. And like I mentioned, do try to remove those triggers and see if there's any improvement. And if there isn't, definitely see your primary care provider for more help.
Yeah, treatment options. What treatment options are available?
Yeah, so with Crohn's, I would say to keep it as simple as possible, I would say steroids, steroid tablets specifically can help with like the acute flare ups.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people get put on immune therapy. And what I mean by immune therapy is, to keep it at a simple level, uh, we can give these medications that help to basically target these antibodies that are acting out on their own, going rogue and causing this inflammation and reacting to the foods and other things that they come into contact with. They're expensive treatments, but typically, steroids will be used more so for acute flares. And steroids, what I mean by steroids isn't the type that, you inject to, gain more muscle at the gym. I mean, steroids to actually like help to suppress your immune system. That's what steroids are good at doing. They reduce the inflammation and reduce how your body is responding to whatever is going on.
Warning signs. That's some. Should someone, the warning signs you just talked about, someone should see a doctor right away?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I
Okay.
think if your symptoms are persisting, especially over the course of months, you've tried some of the non-medicine related ways to manage it, lifestyle changes, etc. Definitely go see your provider. And like we mentioned earlier, if you're seeing blood in your stools, you're having persistent diarrhea, any weight loss, those are kind of key concerns to get worked up more.
And Dr. Avacobo, since we're coming up on the final minute of the broadcast, what is the biggest piece of advice that you have for people who may be dealing with digestive issues and but they're nervous or they're embarrassed because you know how society is
Yeah,
nowadays.
I do.
So what advice do you have for them?
That's a good question. I think now more and more social media is helping with exposure and allowing people to find, an alliance with a group and community online to be able to figure out what's going on with themselves. But I will say that's a double-edged sword too. I think while there's maybe less stigma in certain spaces, especially in social media, I do also think that it's easy for people to self-diagnose. Definitely do some research, self-educate yourself on some of your symptoms and find your triggers, and see where you can kind of reduce the stresses that you're putting on your body, whether it be the type of foods that you're eating or the stress you're going through. Now, if these things don't work, lifestyle changes, weight loss, cutting out, things like smoking, drinking, certain processed foods, definitely see your provider and definitely try to get help and guidance on what's going on, because remember, a lot of this stuff is internal. All you're seeing is the external symptoms, but we may not know what's going on internally. So you do need to go see your provider, and they can provide guidance on how to help you.
Dr. Abakova, thank you for joining us. Remember, you always have an open invitation, right?
Thank you. I know.
All right.
Appreciate you.
And family, don't forget, April is IBS Awareness Month, but digestive health, as you heard Dr. A say today, this is something that we need to take care of all year round. The good news is that there is help available. And if you're dealing with the tummy issues, like he talked about, the ongoing pain, the reflux, the bloating, changes in your bowel habits, or other digestive concerns, as you heard Dr. Avacoba say, talk to your physician. make sure you talk to your physician and schedule that appointment and do it today. Remember, digestive issues, that's one of the things that took Darwin away from us. So make sure you do that today. So, ladies and gentlemen, this wraps up today's broadcast. Our next broadcast is Tuesday, April 28th. Mark the date. And I can tell you, spring and summer are upon us because we're focusing on the feet. Note to self, see nail tick. But for our producers, Lindsey Graham and Ray Thomas, and the hardworking people behind the scenes, I'm Omega Jones. Thank you for listening to and watching Cape Fear Valley Health's Making Rounds Live.
Your station for inspiration and information. 1600 AM, 99.7 FM, WIDU1600.com. We are WIDU Fayetteville. We do radio. Follow us on Facebook at WIDU 1600 AM.